Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. So today we're going to be talking about breeding the Amano shrimps. And I'm finally at 1,000 subscribers. So thank you guys so much. Really excited to be able to do the live streams for you guys. I know that the Amano shrimp video is one of the most popular ones on my channel. So today I wanted to do a live stream and talk about a lot of the questions that I got from that video, as well as sort of what I've been doing. Because when I make the video for part one, I have to think a lot about how to actually uh, cut the video so that I only provide sort of the best or the most important information. But the reason I do a lot of research and a lot of experimentation before I get to that is because being able to use my experience and then guide it is the best way to to cut the video. So let's get started. I wrote some notes down to remind myself. And the first thing I want to talk about is a lot of people have had problems with growing enough algae to to feed the shrimps. And indeed, the problem that I've started to realize is if I do a 24-hour light and I just keep that on for the entire time that the amanos are in the water, in the salt water, the problem becomes that as they get older, there's not enough algae to 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 feed every single one of the shrimps. So there's a couple ways you can get around that. Number one is to just start that earlier. So if you're in the summer, especially if there's a lot of light coming down from the windowsill, you can actually make the salt water and put it outside, let that algae grow. Um, but if you aren't, the second best way, and the way that I'm actually doing it now, is to just get phytoplankton. Because if you have phytoplankton, that solves pretty much all your problems. The phytoplankton, once you actually add them into the tank, they'll actually grow and grow and grow and reproduce, and then it'll consume a lot of the nitrogenous wastes from the shrimp themselves. And then that way you can actually get um, both the food as well as your water filtered a little bit better than if you were just feeding something like dead, like crushed fish food or yeast. And so, because we don't want a super long, super fast current and and a lot of bubbles going through, what happens is the phytoplankton ends up falling and drifting onto the bottom of the tank and the sides where the actual shrimp like to graze on. So, I think if it was just me, I would really like to just keep using the phytoplankton. I got one, and the species that I use is called Tetras. There's another one called Nanochloropsis, and both of the two types of live phytoplankton will work because I ended up actually getting both Tetras and Nanochloropsis, and I put them all into the same container because what happened was the tetrasomas that I got the first time contained nano at the same time. There was, I guess, the word would be contamination, I think, but it ended up working in my favor. When you're actually growing phytoplankton, though, you want to make sure that you split the different species so that there's no like competition between the two because most of the time one ends up out competing the other. The only difference between the Nanochloropsis and the Tetraselmis is the Nano is a little bit smaller than the Tetraselmis, and the Tetraselmis species can actually move. They're modal, so they can move through the water and search, for light, and you'll see them actually go towards the light all the time. But the Nano Chloropsis, they're sedentary, they're non-modal, so they'll just sink to the bottom unless you have that current keeping them afloat. And over here on the side, I guess you guys can kind of see down here is actually where my microscope is, where I take all my pictures. So currently, I have two batches. One of them is a little bit more than the other, and they're in the phytoplankton now. And if you actually take a look, you can't really see through the container because there's just so much phytoplankton. It's very green. But on the bottom, I have a lot of sort of sediments from the phytoplankton, and I find that the shrimp actually like to graze rather than filter feed. So if it was me, I would get phytoplankton if you're having trouble with the feeding. And the way you're going to be able to tell that is on about day 7 or so, you're going to see a dramatic die off from day 7 to about day 11 or so. And this dramatic die off basically means that you don't have enough food, because at that point, the larvae actually really start to feed a lot more. And then they don't have enough food, and they'll die until the balance between the number of shrimps that you have and the food that you have in the tank is even. So one of the papers that I think everyone should read would be a paper written in 1984 by two Japanese scientists. And those guys are, I think their names are Hayashi and Hamano. I'm not Japanese, so I apologize if I butcher their name, but I'm going to go ahead and link it. This should be a PDF, and I'm going to pin it on the top. And in case you guys have any questions, go ahead, drop it in the chat, and I'll try to answer them. But this PDF basically is a very good background information, I think, for breeding the Amano shrimp. The only couple of differences that I see between that paper and my own experience is that Hayashi and Hamanos, they talked about how 17 parts per thousand water salinity is sort of the best way of breeding these shrimps. And I know in part 1 I talked about 35 ppt being the best. And the reason for me saying that is because for me, when I put my shrimps in 17 parts per thousand, I see a very dramatic decline in the number of shrimps within the first week that I put them in. Whereas the same batch, so I split it up into both the 17 and 35. The same batch, the 35 shrimps, kept going on, and they lived and they did really well. Whereas the 17 parts per thousand, same type of feeding, same foods, they just died on me after about a week or so. I couldn't find any more. So that's why in part 1, I recommended 35. After a while, though, I realized that Hayashi and Hamano, plus a couple of other people that were really hardcore, breeding the Amano shrimp, they also suggested to use somewhere around 17. I think I see like 14 and 18 and somewhere around 17. So if I were you and I was starting out, I would split my batch into 17 and 35. Remember, you have to start with the same batch because it's not accurate if you do one batch and then the second batch, right? So you start and split them into 2 cups, same conditions except for the salinity, and then you check which one does better. And after that, just stick with whichever one does better, 17 or 35, it doesn't matter. Just stick with one. The other thing from that paper is Hayashi and Hamano stated that the shrimps actually don't start eating until the first couple of days have passed. I think it was like 5 or 6. I don't remember. But basically, they were saying like you don't need to feed the first couple days because they're not going to eat anyways. I found that to be incorrect because what happened was, to test out every day, I would look at them under the microscope and I would look for their sort of alimentary GI tract, and I would see if it was filled. And starting from day 2, I was able to see sort of little pieces of algae and little bits of food in their GI tract. So either, my shrimps grew a lot faster, or we have different sort of subspecies or strains of Amano shrimp. So if it was me, I would start putting in the phytoplankton, the algae. I would definitely prepare the algae before I put the shrimps in. I wouldn't go off of what Hayashi and Hamano said that the first couple days are okay. You don't have to do anything. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's sort of a trial and error that you have to really go through um, before you figure out this specific fish and this. The fish beast said, "Hey man, congrats." Well, thank you, the fish beast. I'm glad you are here. This is my first stream. So where was I? Okay, talking about the paper that Hayashi and Hamano wrote. Let's see. They also said that the larvae did best with a combination of algae as well as um, ground or ground up crushed fish food. And so for this next batch that I'm doing, I'm on probably a week into this next batch, and I'm trying to do all my filming for part two and do all of my testing for part two for this one so that I can edit over winter break and then have it out at the end of December or January. And basically, they said that a mix between foods will offer the best type of nutrients, and I think they had like 80% success. So for this one, I definitely want to try both fish food as well as live phytoplankton. There's a product online, and you can also find this in fish stores because it's pretty common for the people who are doing saltwater fish. I think it's like a Seachem phyto or Seachem phytoplankton. Let me find it on YouTube, Google for a little bit. It's called reef phytoplankton by Seachem, I think. Yeah. And so this product is actually not live phytoplankton. And the problem that I have with feeding sort of dead foods or prepared foods is that because I'm always growing in a pretty small container, less than a gallon, um, it'll foul up your water pretty fast if you do that. It's preserved dead phytoplankton, and I'm sure that your shrimp will eat it, but the parts that they don't eat is the problem. It's going to foul up your water. Same with if you add a bunch of yeast or a bunch of crushed fish food. So that's why I want to stick with live phytoplankton for this specific batch that I want to. And if it goes really well, I'll go ahead, shoot that video, edit, and have that out for part two. Let's talk a little bit about one of the biggest problems that I had in the comments below for part one was people didn't know when to tell or how to tell that their females will drop, because you see your shrimp that it's buried, and then you're like, okay, when do I put it out? Because one day it's not buried anymore, it's released into the community tank, and all of your fish have just had a really great snack. So the way to tell, there are two different ways, and the first one is a little bit better than the second, is you sort of track your shrimp, that specific shrimp, if you can. You track that shrimp and you say, okay, the last time it dropped on day 14. And this is a real example. I'm thinking about a particular shrimp that I have. The last time it dropped on day 14, and then the next time it did day 16, and then the one after that, it was day 13 again. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the average is pretty good, like around a certain amount of time, about a 2 week, a little bit longer than 2 week mark. What you should do is on day 12 or day 13, you really want to be looking at that female and looking at the eggs under her, because the eggs will tell you when that they're about to hatch. If you look really carefully, and what I would do is I would catch the female, put her in a little clear cup so I could see very well. And then you have a light shining towards you, and you look sort of with the light behind you, and you look at it, the eggs will have these little black dots on them. And those are where the eyes are of the little babies inside the eggs. Those little black dots will tell you that they're almost ready with finishing development, and they're ready to hatch. So checking for those little black dots is sort of the best way to tell. It'll always be your best way. The second way to tell is to look at the female herself and see if she's saddled again, because the female will molt, she'll lay eggs after mating with the male, and she'll incubate those eggs under her pleopods, under her swimmerettes, right? During that time that she's incubating, she's eating, she's consuming more food, she's growing more eggs, right? So if you see that the female is saddled already and she's got those the earlier batch under her body, under her swimmerettes, and she's always doing this, then that would be another way of saying, like, okay, the female's probably ready to drop another batch. She's probably looking to get rid of this first batch. Plus, I see those little black dots, and this tells me sort of in combination that the female is pretty much ready to drop. The last thing that I want to talk about is a little less easier to tell, because there's always a variety of colors of Amano shrimp. Even though they all look pretty clear with little dots on the side, there's always a difference. Um, is to look at the color of the eggs themselves. If they're brown or yellowish, that usually means that they were just laid. That when the shrimp start developing and they're getting towards the Cooper Aquatics said, "Congrats, fish fam. Thank you so much, and thank you for dropping in." Um, the color actually becomes more tan, or sorry, not tan, more greenish gray as the eggs develop. So if it's green gray eggs, you see those little black dots, and the female has a saddle, I would go ahead and pull the female out. That would be the time where I say, it's time for me to put the female in a different cup. So, how to induce the female to give birth? Most of the time, if you put her in a smaller cup, and I'm talking about, this is my water bottle, and it doesn't matter what color it is, but if you have a clear cup or something like a 2-liter bottle of soda with the top cut off, what you can do is you can put in an airline, no air stow needed. Just put in an airline, have that current going through, and then put the female in there with the community tank water. You don't want to put her in, fresh water, tap water, dechlorinated water. Don't do that. Just put her in the same community water, because that's what she's been used to. And you really want to put her in there in the afternoon. You only need about a cup and a half of water, about 200 milliliters of water. But once you do that in the afternoon, the female will get stressed out. She's going to get really stressed out. And with the circulating current, that's actually going to induce her to sort of release her eggs. And so she'll release the eggs most of the time that same night that you put her in. I know a lot of fish like to spawn in the morning at first light, but I found that if I were to just put her in at about 2 3 p.m., by the time it gets to 10 p.m. at night, she's already released all her eggs. And or 11 o'clock at night, she's already released all her eggs. You'll see actually the way that she fans the eggs with her legs like that. um, it'll induce the eggs to hatch. It's pretty cool. I don't know how. Maybe there's some sort of mechanical, physical motion of doing that will make them hatch, or there's some hormone that she releases. But she'll release them because, remember, the airline is creating that really great current, and she thinks that she's in the river, great current, and the babies will follow the river down into the sea. So that's how you induce her to spawn, to lay her eggs. And then 10 o'clock, 11 p.m. at night, you have this whole container full of little babies. So at this point, you use a flashlight and you can check if the female's done. Go ahead, stick your finger in. Make sure you wash your hands real well first, so you're not introducing any sort of weird bacteria or oil from your hands. But stick your finger in, and you could use your fingers to catch the female. Don't use a net, because obviously you're going to net out all of your other larvae. but you can use your hand, pick up your hand, and then put her back into the tank. Of course, make sure they have the same temperature, and I'll actually usually just float that container on the top of my community tank, right, with about a 2-3 inch space at the top so that the female can't climb out, because Amano shrimp are really great at climbing, right? So you want to do it in a way that the Amano shrimp won't climb out back into the community tank, but you also want to make sure that the temperature is the same. And since you're only keeping her in there for at most like one night, you could also, put her in, forget about it, wake up in the morning, and then remove the female too. She's not going to eat the larvae. She doesn't eat the eggs. But you can put her straight back in because it's the same water, right, from your community tank. So that way you're going to have this whole sort of cup full of larvae. And at this point, this is the fun part. The reason why I check in the middle of the night is because I can use a flashlight and track all of the babies. And then I'll take a turkey baster and I'll drop them straight into the 35 ppt water or the 17 parts per thousand water if that's better for you. But either way, use the turkey baster and then you just suck them up because the little babies will follow the light, right? So you just put them on the top, they'll follow it, suck them up, put them back in. It's okay if the community tank water goes into your container. It's not bad. And the reason why I'm using such a small amount of water is because if you're adding fresh water into your 35 ppt, it's not going to be 35 ppt at the end. It's going to be like, down to maybe 32. That's perfectly fine. You can add just a tiny tablespoon, not tablespoon, just a tiny pinch of salt back, or you could just wait for the water to evaporate, right? The reason why I chose 35 ppt isn't because that the shrimp have to stay in 35 parts per thousand. And if they don't do 35, if it's 34.5 or 36, they're going to die. No, it's because I've chose 35 because I found that they do okay anything down to like 31, 32, and up to 36, 37. So 35 is that, ideal range where, if you forget about them for a couple days, there's evaporation, it goes up to 36, 37, you'll be fine. Or if you add too much water in the beginning and it's, 32, 33, you're also probably going to be okay. The salinity can fluctuate just a little bit, it's not going to be a problem at all. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was acclimation. In part one, I talked about how you want to do a 3 to 5, and then I think I changed it in the description below to 2 to 3 minute acclimation between, putting the shrimp from freshwater into saltwater. Well, I realized that you don't really need to do that. You could just, drop them straight into the saltwater and they'll be perfectly fine. Let's see. And some of the things that I've learned from part one are things that, really only comes with experience. And in part two, I kind of want to change some of my methods because I feel like with the experience that I've learned, there's so much more that I can do now, or so much more things that I know now that looking back at part one, some of the things that I said are none of the things that I said are wrong, but they might not set you up for as much success and give you as high of a yield as I personally would prefer if I were watching a YouTube video online on breeding Amano shrimp. And I realize that my video is probably one of the few that are really, really comprehensive. So Chubbs Aquatics asked, have you heard of Amano shrimps have viable eggs in full freshwater if it is hard? So with hardness of the water, you're really measuring two types of ions, calcium and magnesium. Whereas for salt water, you're really looking at a whole mix of ions, especially things like sodium and chloride, right? For me personally, I've never had success with freshwater Amano shrimp growing to sort of anything past a week or so. And the reason for that, I think, is because the larval shrimp really need salt water or some salt in the water in order to survive. What actually happened once was I I had like the shrimp, and the female laid eggs, and I put her back in like I was talking about earlier, and the larvae I siphoned out as much as I could, and then the rest were sort of unhatched out eggs, and I was lazy that time, so I just poured the rest of the eggs into my outdoor tub, and I forgot about them. And then a couple of days later at night, I was sort of checking my outdoor tub, and granted, there's nothing, no fish in there, nothing else in the outdoor tub, just some plants. So I know there's not any sort of fish that'll eat the larvae, but I actually saw some of the shrimp that hatched out later in freshwater. So of course, I'm trying to pipette as many as I could back into my setup inside. Any issues with the agent? Okay, I'll answer that later after this one, Fish Beast. But once I pipette them in, I know I saw a ton more outside in the tub that I wasn't able to get. Over the course of the next couple of days, I gradually saw smaller and smaller amounts. So what I assume to be, or two things, right? Number one, they just can't survive in fresh water. No way. The second thing is that some other type of crustacean is eating them. Maybe some sort of water mite or other predatory, microorganism is eating them. But overall, every single person that I've talked to that's had success have always been using actual salt water at 35, 36 ppt or brackish water at 17 parts per thousand. And briefly, I'm just going to talk about something, I went into depth earlier about this, but 17 parts per thousand seems to give people success too. And it seems like the people who get the Amano shrimp have two strains. One that whose babies need to stay in 35 parts per thousand, me included, and another one whose babies will die in 35 parts per thousand and will only survive in 15, I mean not 15, 17 parts per thousand. And that seems to be the best sort of salinity to raise them at. So what I suggested earlier is if you have a female with babies, right, you have a batch, and you pour half of the babies into the 17, half of the babies into 35, and do the same feeding, same everything, and then see for yourself which one works better for you. And then the next time you can stick to that salinity. So Fish Beast says, great info. Any issues with age of the female? I'll be trying it with a 3 to 4 year old one. So as long as your female is sexually mature, that's about 6 months after after you breed them, after they're born. As long as your female is sexually mature and you see that she lays her eggs, I don't think there will be too much of a problem for you to do it with a 3 to 4 year old female, because basically, if she's laying eggs, if she's having those eggs, you're probably going to be able to have some sort of success. The biggest problem that people have when they're breeding is they don't have enough food, or their water isn't the right salinity. They don't have the best type of filtration, something like that. So let's see. Let's go. I'm going to go through some of the comments, some of the questions that I've had, and I'm going to try to answer all of them. Let's see. Oh, this one's good. And I'm going to talk about this in part two once I release it. But how do you regulate the temperature while in the containers in the small aquarium? Um, the way I do the temperature right now is, if you go back to part one, you'll see that I have a 10-gallon tank, and then I actually put the container of the shrimps inside that 10-gallon tank. What I can do, because it's inside a bigger aquarium, is I can fill up that 10-gallon tank, a certain amount, so that the water is it's like a water bath, like a hot water bath, like a sauna, right? And I'll put a heater in, and the heater will heat up, and then it'll circulate that water for me, so that I always have a certain degree of water inside the tub. And by sort of putting that container inside the tub, I'll have that all winter long. I won't have to like stop doing that. And sometimes, because I'm running an airline through the filter of the Amano breeding tank, I can put a T splitter on it, and then put another airline into the outside, and so the bubbles will add even more circulation. But it's not needed if you don't have one. That's fine. Wish I could get Amano shrimps other countries get in Australia. Um, I would just look online, ask around your local fish store. If they can't get if locally you can't get them locally, I would ask sort of online. And you could, of course, you could Google and see if any shrimps are getting sold from stores. But another really great method is to join your local aquarium club, and then that way, ask around, look for people with Amano shrimps, get a couple of them if they are selling, because the problem with Amano shrimp in the fish stores is they're usually too young for you to be able to tell male and female. I got lucky because that batch of shrimps that my local fish store got in that week ended up being big enough for me to sort of tell male and female. And so I told the guy, like, there was like 50, 60 in the tank, and I was like, I want that specific one. I want that specific one. And so I was able to get a male and a female because I've raised a lot of Neocaridina shrimps, and the Amano shrimps, actually, the way you tell male and female are pretty similar, right? And I was able to get a pair. Plus, I'm a grad student. I'm pretty broke. And so I don't have sort of the money to get a whole batch of them and raise them up. But being able to talk to another breeder or someone else who has Amano shrimps, you can actually say, okay, so I see that you have a buried female. How much are you willing to let that female go for? Or you can trade. The way I ended up getting more females was I went to my local aquarium society, and I said, hey guys, I have a ton of plants. I don't know what to do with them, and if you guys have any sort of shrimps, any Amano shrimps that are buried, please consider trading it with me. And so that's actually how I got more females. You only need 1, 2 males, right? But the more females you have, the more batches that you get. So try to trade around aquarium societies in your local area. Um, and then the Fish Beast said you can do a sous vide circulator too. I'm not sure what that is, but Google it real quick. Thank you guys so much for dropping in tonight too. This is my first live stream. I just finished all my finals, so it's smooth sailing for the rest of winter break. I'm not sure what that is. It's coming up with like food things. But hey, if it works, it works. I got the idea of a 10-gallon tank and the heater from I used to work in a lab, and that's how we incubated a lot of the bacterial cultures that people were growing, is to just use a water bath with hot water on the outside, and that way it really, really helps. I think at this point I've offered a lot of advice on an experience, but I want to say I myself am also working a lot on things that I think I can improve. Um, so things that I can improve is I really want to be able to acclimate the shrimps back to freshwater once they've metamorphed into tiny baby shrimps, because I want to improve that, because when the last time I tried, I feel like the way I acclimated them was either too harsh or too slow, because ended up happening is I tried to do the 50% a day method, where you would have pure salt water and then you dump in the same amount of water from your freshwater tank. And so you would take it down like 50% of salinity, right? You go from 35 to around 17. You go from 17 to around 8.5, and then the third day you do 8.5 to 4, and then the fourth day you put them back in your communion tank and you're good. That method seems to work with a lot of people out there who claim that they have Amano shrimp. The problem with me is after the first day, they kind of just passed away. They didn't do that. So the next time I'm going to be drip acclimating, because a lot of people, you know, once you start breeding a mono shrimp, it's kind of like this rabbit hole. In the beginning, everyone's like, can't be done, too hard, don't do it. And then you just see like one or two people um, who do it, and then they're like, this is how you do it. So after speaking with them, they seem to run into the same problems that you run into, and then they go and then they try to solve it, and then you can see, okay, what method works for me? You can take their knowledge, make it your own, stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Lock Lane Gross said, aquarium hobby in a nutshell. I agree with you completely. So this time I'm going to be drip acclimating them over the course of like 6 hours. I'm going to start with a big container, add a little bit of salt water in the Amano baby, and then dripping. I'm filling it up until I can barely find any sort of salinity left. And that way, I think, is really, really going to be better, because it's a much gradual change every time than just going straight from 35 to 17 to 17 to 8.5. Because I feel like that big jump in the beginning is going to, have some negative effects on your shrimp. Let's see. It'd be interesting to see if the method of breeding Caridina multidentata, that's Amano shrimps, would be the same as Caridina typhus. I don't know what that is, so I'm going to Google that real quick. Well, it looks very similar to Amano shrimp, but I don't know what those are. Australian Amano shrimp. Seeing this shrimp is kind of weird, because I didn't tell you guys this, but I have a female Amano shrimp that look a lot like this Australian Amano shrimp. And she doesn't have that clear body and the dots and the lines, dashes on the side. She actually has sort of, the wedges on the top, like triangular wedges of ivory colored, and it's not a straight line on the back. And her body is a lot darker. Sometimes it's like dark brown to black, even with little white specks. And so it looks a lot like this new Amano shrimp that I just learned today. But that's the only female that I have in there of that type. And I know for a fact that I don't have any males other than the Amano shrimp that everyone else sees, the Japanese one. And that female, consistently becomes buried. She's very, very, actually, I feel like she's even more prolific compared to the Japanese one. And so I can only guess that she's either mating with the male in the tank, the Japanese version of the in the tank, or she already mated before I got her from the fish store, and she's able to store the sperm just like female guppies can. So I don't know, man. The method of breeding so far seems to be the same. Um, the same salinity, 35 parts per thousand. The larvae are developing at a pretty similar rate. I'm on day 6 right now of her of the batch of babies from her, but You know, that's interesting. If they're two different species and they can, crossbreed, I'm interested to see what the babies end up growing up and, looking like. So definitely something that I'm looking forward to. And that'd be great. I've always wondered like why that female looks different, but seeing that there's another version of the Amano shrimp, probably that makes sense. So, if anyone else has any questions about Amano shrimps, I'd be happy to answer it. But I feel like I've answered most of the questions that I want to talk about. So let me just leave the. Let's see if there's anything else I want to mention from the comments from part one, because I know a lot of people actually put in some comments. If you're like me, you're 100% freshwater fish tanks. You're not someone who um, is a saltwater person, and so a lot of the things like how do I do the correct salinity, that is actually new stuff for you. So with my video series, let's see, let me talk a little bit about what I want to do. So part one, I already talked about some of the things, the such as conditioning them, sexing shrimps, first week into the first week, and like transferring them to saltwater. For part two, I want to do a little bit of an update on some of the methods that I talked about in part one to help you guys succeed a little bit more. Because so I'll talk about phytoplankton a little bit. I'll talk about just dropping them straight into salt water. That's perfectly fine. But part two, I want to go all the way up until they've metamorphed, you've transformed them back into fresh water. And I want to, at the beginning, I want to show that shot of the shrimps being in salt water with plants and everything to catch people's eye. Part three is probably going to be sort of Q&A of the common things that people had problems with, right? So I'll be answering a lot of the things that you guys are seeing in this live chat, because I want people to say, okay, I see part one, I see part two. By the end of part two, I'm able to breed shrimps. And then if you're really into it, you get part three, which is like me talking about all these weird things. And then also part four, which is like me showing you how do I grow my phytoplankton? How do I check my salinity? Sort of those things for people who are like me, who've just started growing Amano shrimps, and then if you've already if you've already done saltwater, you know how to measure salinity, you know how to grow phytoplankton, things like that. I want to keep in the back for people who like, if you really need help, go ahead and check it out. If you don't, perfectly fine. Just watch one and two, and you'll be perfectly fine. So someone else on the comment said, first trial I dumped all the hatch larvae to salt water directly, and all died. Second trial I used the method of acclimating them and dumped them in water, and they're all dead again. Interesting. If they're within minutes and dying, the two biggest problems that I have with that is going to be your chlorine in the water. You forgot to put dechlorinator, or something like a temperature shock. Those are really, really fast killers. Whereas, if your salinity is off by a little bit, those aren't super fast killers. Within minutes, though, they will kill. Temperature and chlorine will kill your fish and your shrimps. Um, and one thing to talk about is the Instant Ocean brand of ocean salt mix, artificial water, that does not contain dechlorinator. You have to, when you mix your salt water, put in your tap water, add your dechlorinator, and then add in your salt. That way, you'll be sure that you got rid of all your chlorines, chloramines before you add in your salt. Another thing that I want to talk about is, if you only have access to salt water artificially, you really, really want to look into things like live phytoplankton. And someone else that I talked to, instead of immediately doing phytoplankton, what they did was they took a pre-filter sponge from their freshwater tank and they just dropped it into the salt water. After a while, the babies were able to graze from that really mature used pre-filter sponge, and that seemed to actually work too. Um, but overall, he also ended up using live phytoplankton. I think live phytoplankton might be the way to go if you are looking to increase your yield. But if you are just looking to start out, a method like the pre-filter, or if you're just letting it grow out in the sun for a while, that will give you success. It might not give you the most success. I think that's how things should be. Once you get more experience, you can do live phytoplankton. You can grow them like if you're a saltwater person and you grow like rotifers and copepods for your reef tanks, you can hatch Amano shrimp, not a problem. Just grow 'em. A lot of it is similar to growing copepods. Okay, let's see. Someone said that their algae was overgrown. So if you guys took a look at my first video in part one, the algae that I had was brown on the bottom and on the sides. Those are more of like diatoms, which are a little bit different. But over the next couple of weeks, the sort of slower to grow algae, but more evolutionary, more adapted to the water, will start to grow. And what that's going to do is the algae will outcompete the diatoms. Seems to me, at least, that the babies like to eat the brown algae, the diatoms, a lot more than sort of the greenish, reddish, pinkish um, um, algae. So if it was me, um, and I see that I'm growing the diatoms, I would start another container of the diatoms, just let them grow out, and then as sort of the other sort of algae is growing in, I would maybe think about supplementing with another type of food like phytoplankton or something. But if you have phytoplankton, you don't need to do anything else. Just add a little bit of fish, crushed fish food, you'll be fine. But that way, you're always getting that brown diatom, and then you're not actually letting the other green algae and the other types of and I'm talking about filamentous algae. They look like little dots on the side when they first come out, but if you look at them under the microscope, they're green filaments. Those things the babies don't like to eat as much. Let's see, what else do I talk about? Hydrometer. Okay. If you look at part one, I actually have Amazon affiliate links to all of the stuff that I'm using. The phytoplankton I got was from Mercer of Montana. It's a U.S. company, and I think they only ship to U.S. company. I like their customer service because when they shipped me the Tetras, I looked at it under the microscope, and the microscope is actually like right here, right? And I looked at it, and there was both two different species. And so I texted them like, "Hey, I think I might see some contamination in your cultures. You might want to look at it yourself." And so they did, and they were like, "Yeah, this is contamination, but I'm more than happy to send you another batch of algae, of phytoplankton. It's called like an algae disc, and that one won't have any problems because it's grown on sort of auger." And if I were you, and this is my first time doing phytoplankton, I would buy the Phytoplankton Culturing Kit. What that'll include is it'll give you an airline, rigid tube. It'll have pipettes and dosing syringes. But the most important thing is other than the live phytoplankton that it has the Gilead's F2 medium, which is like the fertilizer that you use to grow the phytoplankton. in the beginning, if you just add your phytoplankton in and you add your shrimps, the shrimps don't make enough food or poop or nitrogenous wastes for the algae to sustain itself. So you're going to need that phytoplankton food to grow your phytoplankton. And the Gilliard's F2 medium is used because it's safe for invertebrates, it's safe for reefs, corals, and everything like that. So instead of if you're adding something like Miracle Grow contains a lot of other things, and it might. What happens is if say Miracle Grow contains copper, right? The algae might be okay with having the Miracle Grow and the copper in there, and the algae is going to grow really well. But then when your shrimp eat it, right, the first time there it's okay because the algae only has a little bit of tiny amount of copper inside each cell, and so the shrimp is eating it. But after a while, that copper sort of builds up inside its body, and if it's not able to get rid of the copper, it's going to gradually build up until it's toxic. So that's why if we're working with little baby tiny shrimps, I don't recommend using anything but sort of tried and true, proven um, fertilizers. And the more variables that you introduce into your tank, the more problems that you might find, or if you have a problem, you don't really know where the source is. And one of the things that I want to talk about is sort of the scientific method, or like thinking like a scientist. You don't have to have a fancy degree. You don't have to have a fancy sort of thinking when you're trying to breed these shrimps, or if you're ever doing any breeding project with this. The way a scientist think is like this. Where can I find prior before I start? Where can I find prior knowledge, prior evidence? And there's a sort of evidence hierarchy. At the very bottom, which should weigh the least amount, would be something like anecdotal evidence. I heard from my stepbrother's stepmom who realized that their auntie did this with the Amano shrimps, and it seemed to work. That's like a one case out of millions of people on billions of people on Earth, right? But what happens is the anecdotal evidence can be sort of a way of thinking where you're like, okay, so this person probably did this and that. But the reason why it's not good is because people never really tell you everything that you need to know. They always say, like, I think it's this, I think it's that, and then they leave it at that. Well, it could have been something else that they've never really talked about. So the next sort of step that you want to look at is like, has anyone ever written a book on it? Has anyone ever written a research article on it? And I pinned an article on there on the top of the chat. But if you write an article on it or a book, chances are you sort of did some research, did a little bit more research, and so that's like article. And then the one above that is like peer reviewed, really robust. Um, um, they're called, I think, systematic reviews or meta-analysis, where people say, okay, I found all of these people who wrote articles, and this is their data, and this is how I'm going to interpret this data so that the next person that reads my article will see that I looked at every single one of those. I've interpreted them in a way that helps someone else. But the reason that you're never really going to find that on Amano Shrimps is just something that I really hate in this hobby. Everyone hears Amano Shrimps and they're like, can't be done. Don't even try. Too hard. Don't do it. Not going to work in fresh water. No one really knows what they're going to do in salt water. No one really knows what's happening. So don't do it. No way. And what that does is people don't try, number one. And then where do all the Amanos come from, right? They're from the wild, or even if it's a farm that's breeding them, they're probably not going to tell you their secrets either way. So what happens is, as the demand grows, how long is it going to be until the wild, it might not be a problem now, it might not be a problem in 10 years, but What about 50 years? What's going to happen then when, naturally from other sources, perhaps the Amano shrimps are losing their habitat? And so my point is to get out that information so that other people can see my anecdotal evidence, will see that the stuff that I wrote down is a certain, what I wrote down, what are the things that I tried, and then they'll adapt it to themselves, for themselves. They'll try this, they'll try that. Because if I can get 100 people doing this, all trying different things, all saying like, this is what worked for me, what didn't work, that happens a lot faster than if I were to try 100 different things. So that's why sort of I'm doing this. And I know a lot of people who've had the Amano shrimps end up feeling bad that the eggs that the females have will never ever really grow. And then something I want to share with you guys today is 2 days ago I got 4 glow light tetras from my local fish store. I really liked them because they've got that really bright orange stripe down the middle. They remind me of like cardinals, which I had too, but I wanted to put them in with the cardinals because I really like that little orange stripe. And when I'm looking at the fish tanks in my local fish store, I always like to stare at the fish for at least 5 to 10 minutes and say, okay, all of the fish in this particular tank look pretty okay. And then I'll pick out the ones that I want, and then I'm not afraid to be like, yo, I don't like this one. I only want this one because, at the end of the day, you're the customer and you're buying them back to put into your fish tanks. And if if they're dying or they're not doing good, what's going to happen? Well, you might just go back and then return it, and they got a dead fish, and they got to refund you your money. So you're not really helping them by buying back dead fish. And sometimes people will just like be afraid of telling people, the clerk, and being demanding. I'll say that, but let me try to remember my train of thought. Okay, so I brought the tetras back, and I put them into their own container, or their 10-gallon tank. It's filled with peat, moss, and rainwater, and a sponge filter and a heater. Ideal breeding ground for tetras. And the day after, so yesterday, I find all of these white dots in the tank. White dots for most fish means eggs that are infertile or unfertile, not going to be viable. So I'm like super disappointed. I'm like, okay, I just got these tetras. I know I have males and females. I picked them out individually, and now I have all these dead eggs. Like, what am I going to do with that? What's happening? But then I had a mentor tell me, the dead eggs are almost always going to be harder to, or easier to spot than the live viable eggs. Give it a day or two. They only take a day or two to hatch out. And so this morning, I had my coffee. I was sitting in front of the tank, and what do I see? I see these tiny little wigglers moving around, right? So of course I removed the males and the females, the adults, and then I'm just gonna grow them out. My point is, when you have like a question, ask around your local aquarium society, ask people on YouTube, look for things yourself, because the mentors are mentors for a reason. And put yourself out there, ask that question, and people are going to know who you are, right? And once you have success, you should say, okay, this is what I learned. I documented it. I put it down in a video form. I put it on my YouTube channel. I put it on an article online. And the more information is out there, the more people end up being able to make their own decisions. You end up helping the people behind you. And I think it's so important for us to be able to help, the next generation, because everyone starts from somewhere. And having the advice out there, having those people, the more advice you have, the faster our aquarium hobby grows. I don't like the people who grow things and they're like, this is my secret. This is my secret. I'm not going to tell you, because it's not helpful to anyone else. Unless, like, I guess if you're a breeder and you survive on having those secrets, that's different. but that was just a sidebar for today because you know, I'm really excited to getting 1,000 subscribers. It never even hit me that I would be doing a live stream on YouTube for people. Mm, let's see. And I had a question that was sort of sent to me on Instagram. If you don't haven't followed me on Instagram, and I've never like advertised this, but my Instagram is Avatar Aquatics, no spaces, no nothing. Just Avatar Aquatics on Instagram. I just started it. I have like 2 followers, but if you guys want to give me a follow, go ahead. It's probably the fastest way to reach me through DMs. Hmm, let's see. Yeah, so I've got a comment here that says my Amano shrimps all died after 7 days. Two, the biggest die off is probably around that time, 7 to 10 days. Around that time, if something's wrong with your water, if you've not feeding enough food or your water quality is not good enough, that's going to be the day that will sort of that you'll see problems with. Once you hit like 14 days or more, it's smooth sailing from there. Around day 19, 20, you're going to get your first shrimp, and then all the way until like day 40. So they don't metamorph at the same time. They sort of do it one at a time. But from day 20, that's when um, you're in the home run. If your shrimp are fine, then they'll probably be fine for another 10 days. Do you leave the lights on 24/7? And I already answered this in the comments, but in general, if you have the algae, the phytoplankton, no. 12 to 16 hours a day, perfectly fine. If it's next to a sunlight with a lot of windows, perfectly fine. Don't have to do 24 hours. If you don't have algae and you're using sort of just, you know, filter filter scum, um, yes, keep it on for a little bit longer. It will increase the algae and, through that, increase your yield of babies. Also, how awesome is it that we're able to see so many people from all around the world? People from Australia. I had some guy from Iran message me. We had to talk through Google Translate. It's pretty cool. I had Amano Shrimps and she's had eggs a few times. I was doing a water change, put the clean water in, and bam, all these things going around looking like little bits of fluff. Was worried I had parasites or something, but then realized she wasn't carrying anymore. Yeah, water changes will trigger your shrimp to lay eggs and release the eggs if they already are buried. If you are waiting for your female to lay eggs or to drop, what I would do is I would not do water changes in the next couple of weeks until your female leaves, because that way you try to get rid of that sort of triggering thing that'll help them release her eggs. So that's the reason why I mentioned that comment. And what you can do is actually, I have an expo marker. It's like a whiteboard marker for people. Um, this is completely safe on your glass. You can write it and erase it, not a problem. So what I would do is, because I only have a few females, I can tell which one is which by sort of just looking at them, right? I would say I would write the day that I find the female buried, just FB female buried, or FB2 if it's like your second female, right? Put the date out, pull the day that you need to pull that female, because like I said before, every female has a different sort of cycle, and so you need to look at a lot of different things in order to figure it out. So I didn't really have a set time for when I want to leave this stream, but since it's already been an hour and this is our first one, if no one has any questions that they want to put into the chat, I'm going to try to end it around 8:10. So 70 minutes total stream time. I'm going to try to end it in at 8:10. and then gonna go eat some dinner. Some guy said he has no access to seawater. That's perfectly fine. As long as you're able to order some artificial seawater, you'll be fine. Just food is the biggest thing. Now, if you're still here and you're wondering like, if I don't have algae, if I don't have phytoplankton, I don't have the money to do that. What do I do? Um, this method will be useful, but it's not going to be super useful, and you might have some sketchy success. You might have to try a couple times before you actually get it. You can crush up fish food, or you can buy the Hikari first bites. Those are or the I think golden pearls is what they're called. Another one, golden pearls fish food. Yeah, it looks like they're called golden pearls fish food or the Hikari first bites. Those are like powdered baby fish food for people. You could sprinkle some in there. You could also do yeast. The way I do yeast is I put them in a separate cup, sprinkle some yeast, add some warm water, mix it around so that the yeast can dissolve, and I'll squeeze it in. The biggest problem with feeding non-live food is contamination of the water. You're not going to be able to get any sort of algae that gets rid of the nitrogenous wastes and the ammonia in the water. So what you're gonna have to do is to do water changes. And, oh my god, I forgot. I never really ever talked about water changes, but about water changes, my schedule is this. If I'm feeding dead live food, I'll try to change it at least once every 4 to 6 days. If I'm not feeding that much live food, so like right now I have phytoplankton, I'm every 7 days or so do a 30% water change of your salt water. Just mix some new ones in. That's going to be perfect because if you have too much phytoplankton and not enough food, phytoplankton is going to crash. Dead, dying, decaying algae cells produce a lot of ammonia, and then that's also going to hurt your shrimps, right? So do the water change depending on how dirty your water is. You got to test your water all the time. Check the salinity and check the ammonia levels. If you have those test strips, I think they're like Tetra test strips. You can Corrier from Macquarie Co-op talks about cutting the strips in half so you have double the amount. Testing it, it actually has some of the things that you need for salt water too. I think the nitrite, pH, and I think that's it. But that's all you need. You don't have to really worry too much about GH or KH or anything like that. Don't worry about it. Um, with water changes, the biggest problem is siphoning out babies at the same time by accident. So what you could do is wait until you're in the middle of the night, nothing around you is has a light. Turn off the lights in the room if you can. Put one flashlight on one end of the container, siphon from the other side, right? And don't siphon the very bottom because that's where all the algae is. But if you don't have algae, you could do that too because that's where all the dead food is, right? That's all where all the ammonia source is. Um, so you siphon out into a clear cup or container, and then you look at it and you say, okay, well, do I see any babies? If I do, pipe them out, put them back in. And then that way, that's going to decrease the chances of you accidentally pouring any babies down the drain, which I've certainly done before by accident. But we always want to make sure we keep as many to grow out as we can and try not to kill anything by accident. Someone said part two. Um, Part two will come out probably at the end of December, depending on this batch. I want to make sure that I've got all the information I've done, all the testing that I've done is legit before I come out with part two. Because, like I said before, I want people to finish part one, watch part two, and then be ready to breed. Part three or four is going to be sort of how-to Q&A stuff like that. Where if you want more information, if you didn't have success with part one and two, come to part three, come to part four, see some of the questions that people always ask me. Yeah. And there's this one guy that Charles Charles B, in the part one, and he had a pretty good tip. Um, the water doesn't have any algae. His first batch died from starving. That actually happened to one of mine too. He uses spirulina powder. That also works. I tried that before. Like powdered algae works too. Um, lights need to be on 24/7. Okay, and what was I was looking for the light tip? Yeah, oh, there it is. So his lighting, you could go and read his comment if you want, but his lighting, he puts it on the side of the aquarium because the Amano shrimps are so small that if they break the surface of the water, they won't be able to swim back down into the water and they'll sort of basically suffocate and die at the top. Especially if you have like a current going through or like an airline going through, they'll die. So what he did was he put the light on the side so that if the Amanos run towards the light, they'll be hitting the side of the container and not the surface of the water. That sounds pretty smart to me, and you know, definitely check out his comment because he says a lot of good things. And it seems to me like, in terms of timeline, everyone has a different timeline. It's always like some guy will have females that breed on day 6. Other ones will females drop in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Mine drop around 2 weeks. You'll have to look it up, figure it out for yourself. These aren't things that I can just tell you sitting from my computer. So yeah, it's 8:11. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in. I'll try to stream more now that I figured out how to, and I will. If you guys have any sort of questions, comments on what I should do next, thinking about things like growing plants, aquascaping, things like that, I really want to talk about. So thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys next time in the next video.